Bringing plagues on Egypt was a big job, and when Aharon had to bring the frogs that were going to swarm throughout the entire country, the question is, how exactly did he do that? Rashi offers two possibilities through which he teaches us an important lesson about getting the job done. Well, certainly when it comes to a spiritual job, our responsibility to mitzvahs or our responsibility to our fellow Jew. So fun pasuk vayet Aharon es yado goyim, the pasuk that says that Aaron stretched out his hand, vatala hatzvadeh vatchas eretz Mitzrayim, and the frog came out and covered the entire Israel. So two things: vatal, the frog came out of the river, or the frogs, and vatachas covered the entire land of Egypt. So Rashi quotes those two words that the tzvadeh came out of the river. And his Mefarish explains as follows. First of all, tzvadeh achas hoisa. It's a singular word, so it tells us that it was a single frog that came out of the river. The Egyptians went crazy. They started to hit that frog. And it spurted out streams of new frogs. So what's Rashi's concern over here? In Pashtus is the Rashi Osin to Bavonon. It would seem that Rashi's concern is why the expression is tzvadeh in the singular if it's going to cover the entire land of Egypt. So therefore Rashi explains that it already was one frog right at the beginning. But because all the Egyptians got involved and started to beat it, it spread into streams and streams of frogs. You find a similar question raised in the Gemara Sanhedrin and in the Medrash Shmos Rabbah, why it says tzvadeh in the singular, and gives two different explanations, and bringt the roof tzvadeyos, two opinions. Rabbi Akiva oimer tzvadeh achas hoisar. Rabbi Akiva says there was a single frog that came out of the Nile, vehi hishritza molekul eretz Mitzrayim, and it spawned out of the normal birthing process millions of frogs that swarmed over the whole of Israel, of Egypt. Rabbi Azariah says, why do you have to create this strange interpretation? It was a single frog that came out. It gave a whistle or a croak or whatever it did, and all the other frogs came out of the river to join it. So therefore, we have to ask ourselves, we've got such plausible explanations, why does Rashi go with such a strange explanation? We know that Rashi's interpretation is miyusa defi pshuto shel mikra, is based on the simplest understanding of the pasuk. Because the principle that Hashem does not do unnecessary miracles is a principle that would make sense according to the simplest understanding of the psukim, as the Rebbe once previously explained. So logic dictates as was hot passiert. If a miracle did occur, the plague of frogs was definitely a miracle. Is as the nest hot and anhalt in derech hateva, to the extent that we could explain some kind of natural parameters for that miracle. Then we don't have to come up with a version of the miracle that completely breaks every known law of nature. Because whatever unnecessary additional miracles, we'd ask the question, Hashem doesn't do miracles unnecessarily. So if that's the case, if the logic of Pshat says, let's find a miracle that is somewhat plausible, why then does Rashi quote the Midrash insight, which is that they hit that one frog and it spurted streams of other frogs? That's the kind of miracle that by hitting a frog, that's going to cause new frogs to emerge, and not just one or two, but streams of them. That is something that has no reading in the natural world. Why does Rashi go with that? Based on Gemara and Shmos Rabbah, where he could have explained, aligned with the Gemara or the Medrash Rabbah, that there was a frog that summoned the other frogs. As Rashi explains then the Gemara, that all the other frogs in the world heard the sound of this frog and they came to join it. Yes, it's a miracle that a frog is able to summon all the other frogs, but it's not a crazy miracle that says you create new frogs by hitting a frog. Or at the very least, go with Rabbi Akiva's opinion as a shritzo, that somehow this frog spawned an incredible amount of new frogs. Which of course would have been completely miraculous, but it would be a miraculous version of a natural phenomenon, birth. His shritza. Rashi explains that the word hishritza means that they came out through the normal birthing process. Why does Rashi go for what would seem to be the most extreme version of the miracle? Now that's not the end of Rashi. He then continues, what I've just explained to you is a perspective according to the Medrash. The simplest way to understand it, a swarm of many frogs could be referred to in a singular word, tzvardeya. And he proves it. You're going to see in the next of the makos, you're going to see with the lice that it speaks about all these incredible amounts of lice, and it says hakinom, which means harakisha, the swarming of lice. And to help the 5-year-old learning Chumash for the first time to really appreciate this, so Rashi translates it into French. Gdulira, that's the word for a frog. My French pronunciation not so great. Belaz. is grinolira belaz. It's a different word, also in French, which sounds very much like a frog, but it's actually the word for a swarm. So, first question. We know that Rashi's primary objective is to explain the simplest interpretation of the psukim. When the pshat HaKosov is nit gelatik, any time where the pshat is not straightforward, then Rashi will borrow from the Medrash to help smooth things over. So how come over here does Rashi do the reverse? How come Rashi first brings the Pirush? That Rashi himself defines as the midrashic approach. Why does he put that before the interpretation that he himself is going to call the pshat? His job is pshat. That's his priority. A little bit more technical question. We get it. There's the word hatzvardeya, singular for a frog, and Rashi has to explain to us that it means a swarm. On the far status with the shen yechidus, which is why it is in the singular, because it's a massive swarm. It's more bepashtus, we understand, and we get why Rashi has to explain it, because it's difficult to believe that the word tzvardeya, single frog, means the spreading of a swarm of frogs, was steht nicht in Pasuk, which is not stated in the Pasuk. And especially because the concept of swarming is not unique to frogs. So why would the word specifically for a frog be the word to describe swarming, which is common to many types of creatures? The fire bringt Rashi haraya, so that's what Rashi is going to have to prove his point by telling us. Vatehi hakinam. Look what's going to happen in the next makkah. Was the taich from kinam is rechisha. There you've got the word kinam, which translates as swarming. Again, even though swarming is not unique to lice, but the Torah will use a word that sounds like the creature to describe the particular swarming of that creature. So that's what Rashi is showing us. The word tzvardeya, which means a frog, can be used by the Torah to describe the unique swarming of frogs, even though swarming is not unique. To put it differently. If frogs had a completely different way of swarming that is unlike any other creature, then you could say the word frog, tzvardeya, Punkt, was meint dem Sheretz, ausgeteilt von alle anderen Schrotzim, just like it's a descriptive title for this creature, which distinguishes it from every other creature, including other Shrotzim, in Oisen, its appearance, its behavior, etc. Also, meant to say sein Ausgeteiltkeit, sein speziellen Shirutz, and you could say tzvardeya also speaks to its unique kind of swarming. Even though that wouldn't be the easiest way to explain it, because the word tzvadeh should have also been a little different. Somehow voweled differently. Like, for example, we don't call it kinim when we're speaking about the swarm, we call it kinam, as we'll explain. But okay, we could have explained it. But as the pasuk sagt, but now that we know that the Torah uses the same word sheretz, which means swarming, both to describe the frogs, right? That that the frogs swarmed right across Mitzrayim. It uses the word sheretz as it used for other. Es lechere schwer zu sagen, dass Tzvadeh meint a Sach, was ist dasselbe bei aller Sheretz Nefesh Chaya. Der Fall ist der Reihe, vati akinam kenal. So, if the concept of swarming is not unique to frogs, and the word Tzvadeh is supposed to represent swarming, we need some kind of proof for that. So he says, hakinam, that will show us the proof. In other words, that will illustrate to us that it's not completely out of the question to have the word Sfardeya mean a type of swarming of frogs, which is not unique only to frogs. Sabanit movement, but still not clear. How's Rashi so absolutely certain that the word kinam means the swarming of lice? So when Rashi quotes the word kinam, he just says it means swarm. He doesn't prove it. How's that so obvious then? It doesn't even bring an alternative. Yet here in our case, when he's trying to describe that tzvadeh means the swarming of frogs, first of all, Rashi only puts it as the second explanation, as yesh loima, that possibly could say that the word representing the swarm of frogs could be represented by the single word frog. There it's so clear in Kinim, and yet it's not. So let's see how some of the Mefarshim try to explain it. Mefarshim say in Masbir, why is Rashi so convinced that kinam must mean swarm as opposed to louse? It's because of the voweling. It's from there was the lashon is kinam nun kemutza. Look how it's spelled, kinam with the comments under the nun. Was is nit lashon rabin kinim. That's not a plural word because that would be a chirik, kinim. And it's definitely not a singular word because then it would have a hey at the end instead of a mem at the end. And darüber muss man sagen, als der meint es nicht dem Shem von kinim. Therefore, must be say the Mefarshim that Rashi can't see the word kinam as referring to the species, not the badait von rechishas kinim, but rather to the behavior of the species, the swarming. Unlike them is move on. So the Mefarshim then continue. Now it would make sense. As der Fall ist, dass ich nicht kein Fullerei, als ich Tzvadeh meint Shirutza Tzvadim. That's why Rashi can't be so absolutely clear and convinced that Tzvadeya actually means the swarm of Tzvadeim of frogs. Weil das von der Lashon Vatala Tzvadeya ist nicht keine Chacha, als das meint etwas anderes für den Namen von Tzvadeya b'lishen yochid, because there's nothing in the word that distinguishes it from the singular for frog. In kinna, kinim, kinam, you see a difference between the word for swarming and the word for louse or lice. But in tzvardeya and tzvardeya, you don't see any difference, and therefore Rashi puts it second and says yesh loima. That's how Mefarshim explain it. And das sech the dirk von Rashi, and by the way, you can even see that in another word that Rashi specifically uses in his interpretation, where it says v'chein v'tiya kinam chulei. Look, it's also how it's described with the lice, that many lice are called kinam, or the swarming. Ve'af, and also, in other words, it's not exactly the same. Is a Mosef Grunolira Belaz, and then of course he gives the French to help explain it. It is interesting that here Rashi is giving us the French for a frog, even though the word Sfar De'im in the plural has already appeared before. He didn't feel the need at that point to translate it. Ist doch verstandig, as Pirish Tzvadim is bewusst. That's because we know what frogs are. Ist nach der, wer Rashi sagt, Shirutz hat Tzvadim, und Pirish Shirutz, Faceman von früher, Vasharatz ha Ye'er Tzvadim. Now that Rashi is talking about the swarming of the frogs, something already described in the Torah, so why now tell us the French? Why? That's exactly what he wants to tell us. That if you translate the word tzfardea as a frog, the French word is grenouille. I think that's how you pronounce it, something like that. The child knows this. It's his first language. Französisch. It's even that way in modern French. Grenouille. But the same word, tzfardea, when it represents the swarming of frogs, that has a different word in French. Grenouillera. Le grenouille meant, I don't know how you pronounce it in French, but grenouillera. You can look it up. They're two different words in French. So what's Rashi telling us? When it comes to kinim versus kinam, in the Hebrew language, you can see visually and hear the difference between the words. In tzfardea, in Hebrew, you can't see or hear the difference, but French helps you to know that there are two different translations for the same word. Even though there's no visible difference between tzfardea meaning a single frog and tzfardea meaning the swarm of frogs, is the pirish grinoli belaz nit grinoli. Rashi shows us that the translation will clarify we're talking about the swarm, not about the individual frog. Now, when you consider that the Torah does refer to a swarm of lice as ki nam nit kukendik was rechisha hatzetan nit bleis mitten min von kinim, which is interesting because swarming is not unique to lice. So it's interesting that a word from the derivation of lice should mean swarm. Was dosit the Schwierigkeit und Aufteilung von Kinam und von tzfardea als rechisha und shiritz, which was our big question. How can you say the word tzfardea, which is unique to a frog, should represent swarms, which are not unique to frogs? As therefore, with all of that information, knowing that kinam is used to represent swarm, put the old French translations together with the principle that it is possible sometimes to describe a swarm, even if the swarm is not unique to that species, by the name of the species. So it's possible to suggest that tzfardea means a swarm of frogs. Perhaps with that information we could also explain why Rashi first brings the Midrash before the Pshat. Because as we've just shown, the Pshat is not so pashut. It's not so clear that tzfardea must mean swarm, so it's a secondary answer. That would be the explanation the Mefarshim give. But we can't really leave it just at that and say that that's the one reason why Rashi puts the Medrash first before the Pshat, because the Pshat is not so easy. It needs to be built on a whole mixture of understanding the French translations and the precedent of kinam meaning a swarm. Let's understand why that's not enough reason to put the Medrash first. If Rashi wants to show us clearly that a particular explanation fits the simple understanding, or nital midrash as opposed to the midrashic understanding, Rashi has two ways that he could tell us that. He uses one of the two expressions. Either he says aleph nun zefal, like in our case it says upshutoi, the simple explanation is X, or sometimes he says beis upshutoi shel mikra, the simple explanation of the text is as follows. What's the difference? Chelek zwischen ze is moving in pashas. It's quite simple to distinguish. If Rashi is saying the simple understanding of the text, what he's telling us is, as the Pirish is like in pshat fun de mikra, then when you see the context of this entire piece of scripture, then from them klolustik and teichen akosov, against the backdrop of the overall message of this section of Torah, the pshat is X. But when Rashi just simply says the word, the simple explanation, on them simfun shal mikra, without using the extra words, the simple explanation in context, means das the Pirush HaPasha blows from dem Wort. It means Rashi is explaining what the word means in its simplest form, or der Inyan, or what the topic means in its simplest form. What that Rashi is dealing with. And it may well be that the simple explanation of the word or the topic will not seamlessly fit with the context. So Pshutoi Shel Mikra means the simplest explanation of the context. Pshutoi means the simplest explanation of this subject. Now, with that in mind, the way it should play out in our case is so why are we arguing that Rashi puts the Medrash before the Pshat is because it's the Tafar because the translation of a swarm of frogs Liknit in word Tzvardea is not so easy to fit into the meaning of the word Tzvardea, frog. Whereas the explanation of the Medrash vos der Teich from Tzvardea is Kipshutoi ein Tzvardea, the translation works better because the Medrash is talking about a single frog, and that would explain why the Torah says Tzvardea in the singular. If that's what Rashi wants to tell us, then Rashi shouldn't have told us the meaning of that word Tzvardea is a swarm. Rather, he should have told us, no, he should have said, the context lends us to understand that Tzvardea means a swarm. Because it wouldn't appear that the context has any evidence to support the great miracle described by the Medrash, that they beat the frog and it spurted out all these other frogs. So therefore, that would indicate that the first explanation is very much a medrash, a miracle that has to be derived through the methodology of medrash because it's not apparent in the words. And in the contextual wording, then from the context, Pshutoi Shel Mikra, we can understand that Tzvardea means a swarm. Rashi doesn't do that. He says Pshutoi, the simple meaning of the word is a swarm. And that doesn't seem to be the simple meaning of the word. And it certainly doesn't seem to give us a reason why the Medrash has to go first. And then there's a really big question which you probably thought of when you were learning the section, because many of us think of it when we learn the section. Rashi has already explained to us in the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach when Yaakov sends a message to Esav and he says, "As derech eretz lo imal shvarim harbe shor." He says, "I have shor." Sounds like he has one ox. Rashi says, no, it's typical to refer to a group of oxen by the singular term ox. It's possible to refer to a large amount of creatures by the name of the singular species. So why didn't Rashi do the same thing here, which would have been such a simple explanation? That the single word Tzvardea, which rose out of the river, actually represents the species of many, many frogs. The only reason it's in the singular is because it's a single species. Simple way for Rashi to explain it. You don't need all this convoluted stuff about hitting the frog and it spurts out all these other frogs. Why doesn't Rashi do that? So the Mefarshim explain. As by Rashi is bothered not just by the presentation here of the word in the singular and what does it mean, how many frogs came out of the river. Rashi's got a bigger issue. Why is this the place, the one place, where Tzvardea is in the singular? In Hemshech von der Parsha V'Timake demon ganzen 10 Mal b'Lashon Rabim Tzvardeim. In the entire story of Makas Tzvardea, the plural word is used 10 times. So why is this the one exception? When the frogs initially come out of the river, it's one frog in the singular. Is there fun gedrungen as das meint nit als shemamin? Must be that it's not describing the species, because everywhere else we talk about the species, we're talking about plural frogs. No, the pasuk meint domad gesehen dem lashon yochid. Here the Torah is clearly highlighting the singular language frog. Because because something must have happened here at this moment that only happened here at this moment, and it's relevant to the singular word. And that's why Rashi goes into the Medrash, which says, well, what happened over here is this is the one time, the only time, that there was a single frog. Which would explain as the Pirush HaMedrash Chotch Siz Adrash, why the interpretation based on the Medrash, which is not Pshat, it's the deeper analysis of Torah, Hotasabra Yisrael from Pirush Shirutz Tzfardim, has a great value and is a lot easier to come to terms with than to translate Tzfardeya as the swarm. In context. The Midrash gives us a brilliant explanation for why this is the outlier, for why this is the only time in the entire Makas Tzfardeya where Tzfardeya is said in the singular. Why? Because here it's one frog. Makes perfect sense. Whereas when you go with the so-called Pshat interpretation, which is that Tzfardeya actually means the swarm, so fine, that would accommodate why the rest of the story uses tzfardim in the plural. Because the only time it really makes sense to use the word in the singular is when you're describing the swarming, so it's when they arrive that they're swarming. But actually, that raises the question in the opposite direction. The truth is, it should have only ever spoken about the frogs in plural if you're talking about a swarm. The Lashon Yochid is not glatik, as we've explained. The singular term over here is not easy to understand. It needs all kinds of layers of interpretation. Especially when you consider that as soon as the frogs came, the magicians of Egypt went out and they made frogs in the plural. I say, why do you have to say tzfardeya? On the bringt das Ashal Tzveit and Pshat. That's why the Pshutoi goes second, because it's not so easy to accommodate. On the Pirush HaMedrash is the Ershto and Iker Pirush the Pshutoi Shel Mikra, and the Midrash is actually easier to understand in the Pshat than the Pshat of the word is to understand in the Pshat. Because it's easier to understand. Tzfardeya is the exception in the singular, because at this point it's one frog. That makes sense. But we still have a question. Mit was der zweite Pirush mehr Pshutoi in Teich von der Werte Vatala Tzfardeya wie der Pirush HaMidrash. But then, with this brilliant explanation of the Midrash, that one frog means one frog, why does Rashi think that swarm is more the pshat of the words? Because Pshutoi, the simple explanation of the word, why does he think that the swarm of frogs is a better translation of the word? It's the bir in them. To explain that, das was Rashi is bavonen is nicht bloß die Schwierigkeit mitzad dem shinui lashon. So to understand this, we have to realize Rashi is not only addressing the fact that there's the switch from plural to singular, which raises eyebrows. Now, nochmer, there actually seems to be a big issue here. Aharon is given an instruction, and what happens next does not seem to be the fulfillment of that instruction. When it says that he conjured up, he brought up one frog out of the river, surely contradicts the direct instruction that the Eibishter gave to Aharon in the previous pasuk, which was, stretch out your hand with your stick, and bring up frogs in the plural. So he is told to bring up frogs, and what happens? He brings up a frog. The fact that it says first bring up and then the frogs, which is nitvi by makasar b'voy state, which is almost the exact opposite of how it works with the locusts. There it says netei yad cheletz mitzrayim bo arbe, or bishvil makas arbe, stretch out your hand for the purpose of the makas arbe, ve'yal gomer, and then they will come up. And the derech by the other makas in similar language applies to the other makos as well. Here it says v'ha'al, that the whole point is v'ha'al, bring up the frogs. Is moving as the tzivit Aharon is nit bagrenetz blaze to the Aharon and aschol from the teis yotchem matechol gomer. That tells you here the Eibush is not telling Aharon you stretch out your arm to prepare for the miracle, to prepare for the makkah, like you stretch out your arm and then the locusts will come. No, your instruction is you make the frogs come up. No, your job Your mission, Aaron, is to bring frogs out of the river, and many of them, Sfardeim in the plural. This is given an oifen from Vatalat Tzvadeya ein Tzvadeya. So Rashi is bothered by the explanation according to the Medrash. How does Aaron fulfill his responsibility to bring out frogs if he brings out one frog? Therefore Rashi draws our attention to the language of the Medrash. The Egyptians beat that frog, and it spurted out streams of frogs. Yes, when Aaron put out his arm, one frog comes out. But what kind of a frog was it? It's the kind of frog that doesn't spawn in the normal birthing process, new frogs. It spurts out frogs. Which means, just as if you would hit the water of the Nile, water would splash. You don't hit the Nile and that creates new water. That was the uniqueness of this frog that came out of the Nile. Makes no difference now who hits it. Therefore Rashi doesn't tell us who hit it, like the Medrash Tanchuma says that it was specifically the Mitzrayim who hit it. Alpizah is verstandig, which explains was Rashi kendon nit einteichen in Gemara Shmos Rabbah. Now we know clearly why Rashi would not borrow either of the other two opinions quoted in the Medrash and in the Gemara. Ashor kol bo, according to Rabbi Akiva, that he whistled for them to come, or that Rabbi Elazar ben Azari that he whistled, or the hishitza molas kolas Mitzrayim, or spawned this massive amount of frogs like Rabbi Akiva. Because both of those opinions would not answer Rashi's key question: how does Aaron fulfill his obligation? Both of those opinions say he brought out one frog. One frog's not what they asked for. Those extra frogs that Aaron was told to bring, either the first frog brought them or produced them. So, according to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, it would seem that Aaron did not fulfill his mandate. Therefore, Rashi bringing them Pirishas Matezes Nechilim. That's why Rashi specifically chose the more extreme version of the miracle, that frog produced the other frogs. So Aaron effectively brought all of the frogs, and they just came spurting out as the Egyptians beat that frog. The Baal Pasuk sagt beferish as the Tzivot Aaron is given v'halas atzfardim l'shein rabim. So now that we have established that the Pasuk tells us very clearly that Hashem's instruction to Aaron was to bring up many frogs, something in the Pasuk has to at least allude to how Aaron fulfilled that instruction, because we don't see a pshat correlation. The pshat is halas atzfardim and vatal atzfardim in the singular. Says the Bir in them, Vatala Tzvadeh can getaish veren leif tzvei oifanim. So it's important, and that will explain why Rashi uses this as his heading, Vatal Tzvadeh, because that can mean two things. Aleph di Tzvadeh is oivgegangen. The simple explanation, Vatal Tzvadeh, that frog came up out of the water. Beis als mafil, Vatal could also mean to cause others to rise. Die Tzvadeh hat gemacht oivgein andere Tzvadim. That frog caused other frogs to come up. Und die zwei Pratim in Pirush HaMedrash. So look at how the Medrash describes it. It addresses both of them. Aleph as Aaron hat aufgebracht ein Tzvadeh. Vatala Tzvadeh. Aaron caused the one to come out of the water. He did exactly what the Pasuk says. Beis as die Tzvadeh hat Meile gewen andere, and that frog then became the one that produced all the other frogs, which is the other Vatal. Veren ongedeit in die zwei Teitchen. You see this in the words in the Medrash. Aleph Vatala Tzvadeh Tzvadeh achas hoiso. First, the Medrash tells us it was one frog. Beis Vatala Tzvadeh matezes nechilim nechilim, and then Vatala Tzvadeh also means that one frog spurted out all these other frogs. The mitzvah durch verstandig was Rashi brings them drash. That will explain why Rashi brings the drash, the midrashic approach. V'matezes nechilim nechilim. If the verta Vatala Tzvadeh onito ifatchas eretz Mitzrayim, and that's why Rashi quotes this midrash, not the part that it's spurting out more frogs as part of Vatchas eretz Mitzrayim, covering Mitzrayim, because it's part of Vatala Tzvadeh. It's part of the initial miracle, which was initiated by Aharon. Hagam der Pirish hat an Anhalt in Lashon HaPasuk Kenal. Now, that actually works well with the language, right? Tzvardeya in the singular fits beautifully with this Midrash, and Vatal has both interpretations, fits beautifully, right? The Midrash fits beautifully with the Pshat. Doch sagt Rashi still tells us, but that is Midrash. Weil dem Pirish muss man sagen, als die zwei verschiedene Teichen, because the Midrash approach is that these two different explanations, I find them from Vatal at Tzvardeya, the two different ways to explain the word Vatal, one that the frog came out, and the other that it caused other frogs to come out. Beide passiert, both happened. Was das ist nicht ausgehalten in der Pshat von Lernen Mikra. That doesn't fit the Pshat. That one word implies two processes. Says the derech from Medrash. That's the language of Medrash to see two different processes in a single word. Like Pshutoi. If you want to take the most basic analysis of the word, you'd have to say that the word Vatal has one message. Vatal. So Vatal, one process happened at that point that had to fulfill the message or the mandate that Aharon was given by Hashem to bring many frogs. So therefore, the pshat, the simplest way to explain it is, Tzvardeya doesn't mean a frog, it means a swarm. And therefore Aharon did his job. From deswegen bringt das Rashi als zweiten Pirish, yet Rashi still reserves that only as the second explanation on the Pirish Ha'ikri is Midrashay, and the Midrashic explanation there was a single frog that got beaten up and exploded into all these other frogs. That comes first. Val Aleph Mitzatech Naksubim is the Pirish HaMedrash Mematim Subshutei Shamikra Kenal Sifei, because as we said, Tzvardeya, meaning a single frog, is a much easier translation, and therefore the Midrashic explanation that goes with that interpretation is closer to Pshat and comes first. And base, secondly, euch der etzam update from Wort Tzvardeya is meglatik let in Pirish from Medrash, we let in Pirish as das mein Shirs at Tzvardim Kenal Sif Gimel, and as we've explained, to get to the point that Tzvardeya in the singular means swarm needs quite a bit of mental gymnastics, whereas to say Tzvardeya means a single frog, which is the Midrash approach, is easier, closer to Pshat, and therefore comes first. Von Yeina Shalteir and Pirshashi, now that's going to teach us a deeper perspective about how we engage with mitzvahs based on this Rashi. We know the general principle is when you start a mitzvah, finish it. Was kommt lieb dem, was man kann Gömer sein, ist nicht Gömer am Mitzvah. Like the Gemara goes into quite a lot of heavy detail, including about some very great people, about what happens if a person starts a mitzvah that they could finish and they don't. Beyond that, especially when you're teaching Torah to somebody else, the way that you teach to somebody else is you have to place it in front of them, as the expression goes, like a table that is set and ready for them to eat. In other words, they shouldn't have to do any additional work. You should present it to them in the best way possible. And if you start teaching, teach the full way. On the one hand. On the other hand, what if you know, as sleep gewisse, for circumstances beyond your control, you're not going to be able to complete the mitzvah you start. So you'd say, well, I don't want to get started. A person should never restrain themselves from starting a mitzvah, and you should at least do what you can. We have a great example of this. Moshe gives us a great example, because Azerot Mavdil given the Gimel Ore Miklat in Ever HaYarden, Moshe designated the 3 Ore Miklat to the east of the Jordan River, where he could actually designate land as Ore Miklat. As Ein Koltas Achi Badlois and Sheberetz Canaan, even though they would be completely meaningless until they would be able to establish the Ore Miklat inside Eretz Yisrael, which was only going to happen many years later. Why? Because his attitude was, if I have the opportunity to do a mitzvah, I'm going to do it. Even if it's not going to be perfect, even if it's not going to be complete. So there's this paradox. Start a mitzvah, finish it. Can't start it, you can't finish a mitzvah, still start it. Moving as a suffix in them. Now what if you have a bit of a question, a doubt? Was is Gemara Shleimus mitzvah? I don't know. I don't know what the conclusion of the mitzvah is. I don't know what it's going to take to complete the mitzvah. Is mitzvahs al derech fun tzedakah. So if it's a positive mitzvah, like giving tzedakah, you don't know what it's going to take to finish the mitzvah, do more. Give more. You don't know, maybe you haven't yet completed the mitzvah. Give more tzedakah, can't hurt. But if there's a mitzvah where perhaps to fulfill it, it's a mitzvah that's going to harm somebody else, so perhaps to fulfill it, I can get away with less, is lo yosef. Don't add more, pen yosef, in case you overdo it and chas v'shalom, the person is harmed. To the extent that Gemara Makkas tells us that the Torah says 40 lashes for a person who deserves lashes, and the Chachamim reduced it to 39 because you do them in sets of 3, and let's rather keep it. Okay, so maybe we won't fulfill the mitzvah bishlei musa, but at least we won't harm anybody, mitzadam chashash from pen yosef, in case we overdo the mitzvah. That same balance between, if you've got a positive mitzvah, rather do extra. If it's a mitzvah that may cause something negative, rather be more cautious. You'll see this reflected in Rashi's 2 opinions. The first explanation, which is the Midrash perspective, that Aharon was one who brought out the frogs, or the frog. But the fact that those frogs then spread through the whole of Mitzrayim, Aharon didn't physically do that. That was the result of everybody else beating the frog. Whereas the second opinion says, the pshat is, tzvardea means the whole swarm. Aharon produced the whole swarm, which then covered the whole land of Egypt. So what's the purpose of these frogs? 2 possible purposes. Aleph bepashtus, the simplest is, makon go from the Mitzrayim. They were there to afflict the Egyptians. So if the purpose is to afflict the Egyptians, Aaron's job is you have to afflict the Egyptians. He's got to bring out the whole swarm. That's the mitzvah. How do you fulfill the mitzvah? How do you fulfill the mitzvah? You've got to bring all the frogs because you've got to afflict all the Egyptians. Base, the other angle is or you could say the purpose of the frogs is to wake Paroi up to the realization that he has to let the Jews go. And if that's the case, then Aaron's job is create the catalyst that they'll react, and they'll actually be the ones who cause these frogs to, so to speak, wake themselves up. In underverted, put it differently. If you look at Torah through the eyes of Medrash, again the pierce from the mitzvah, then you also look at the interpretation of the instruction to Aaron. What is its purpose? It doesn't necessarily have to be many, many frogs, as Vahalas Hatzfardim might sound according to Pshat. Could be Vahalas Hatzfardim actually means you bring out 1 frog, and then they will cause that to transform into the great plague. Because this is about the possibility of harming others, like the mitzvah of Malchus, is Batzri rather reduce what you're going to afflict, and don't overdo it. So now you don't have the concern that maybe I'm going to overdo the mitzvah, maybe cause too much. I'll bring out the 1 frog. They'll already cause the rest of the frogs to come. And that gives us a lesson. The Aharon from the Beida Pirushim is the balanced lesson of how a Jewish person should behave. From the Medrash Pirush, as Aharon from the perspective that Aharon brought 1 frog and the rest took on a life of its own. That teaches us. If when we're talking about something which has a negative aspect, here, harming the Egyptians, we're told, whoa, do your piece, but, hold back. For sure, if it's something positive, do your piece and don't hold back. Make sure you don't miss out from doing the shleimus of the mitzvah. Okay, so a mitzvah which could harm somebody, you still got to do. How much more so a mitzvah that can help somebody, do and do and do and don't stop. And from Zweiten Pirish, von welchen es kommt aus, dass Aharon hat Gomer gewend der mitzvah. And then, of course, the second explanation, which is that Aharon brought the entire swarm, so in other words, he did the entire mitzvah. Then we have the lesson, as man darf sich mishtadel sein zu tun a mitzvah bishleimusa mit chulasa v'ad sefer gemara. We should always try and do a mitzvah till the finish. Und wenn es handelt sich in der mitzvah zu Makar sein, a zweit Niden zu Torah mitzvah zu Salmatera Keneged Kulam. And if we have, for example, the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah to draw another Jew close to Torah and specifically to Torah learning, so then darf man sich nicht benugen mit Hatchalas HaKiruv. We dare not be satisfied with doing the initial job of bringing them through the door. Number darf gehen sein bis ins Sof. We've got to see it through to its fullest conclusion. Work with the person and work with the person and work with the person until it is like they have their set table where the Torah is, the Yiddishkeit is consolidated. But what happens sometimes you don't have the capacity. You can only start the mitzvah. You're only in a position to get the person through the door. Maybe you don't have the wisdom, you don't have the time, you're not going to see them ever again. So a person might think, what's the value in me starting to do something with that person? I don't know if it will have any lasting effect. Who knows what's going to happen later? Maybe it will just be a wasted opportunity. If then come to that, the mitzvah, the message is, if you have the opportunity to do a mitzvah, do the mitzvah. It's actually best not to start overthinking. But the Kavshter Rachmana Lamalach, as the Gemara says, don't start working out the Eibishter's secret plans. It's not our business. Our business is to be proactive, to reach out, to the best of our abilities, to bring the other person close. And you know what happens when we do that? When we do our best to the best of our abilities to reach out and draw another Jew close, the Eibishter combines our best intentions with a practical application. The Eibishter is mitzaref and brings her up to the machshava teva lidei maisa, which means that the Eibishter finishes the job for us. The Eibishter is gomer the mitzvah. When the Eibishter concludes the mitzvah that we began with our good intentions and best abilities, of course it has to be best abilities, not only good intentions. And the Eibishter can finish the job in a way that is completely unrestricted, unfettered, doesn't have the limitations that we have. To the point that it's the most amazing, incredible way that mitzvah could be fulfilled.